Evening, everyone. My name is Melissa Keevey, and I am the interim director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Thank you for attending our third panel discussion of our Dyckman Discussion panel series. I would like to thank our panelists, Donna Marie Barnes, Ariel Violette, Ramin Ganeshram, and Shana Sabio for participating in this panel titled The Atlantic Slave Trade. I would also like to thank PS 98 for hosting us today. And finally, I would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and TD Bank for sponsoring the Dyckman Discussions lecture series. Dyckman Discussions is a 2-year discussion series focusing on exploring topics in New York history, such as the forced removal of indigenous people, Dutch colonization, enslaved labor, and immigration. The Atlantic slave trade is the third panel in a series of 5 taking place in 2023. In 2024, the museum will host a series of community dialogues to build on panel discussions in 2023. These dialogues will discuss issues that are important in today's social and political climate. We hope this project will allow members of the community to connect with each other, resulting in an even more unified community than the one that already exists here in Inwood. I will now introduce our panel chair, Donna Marie Barnes. Donna Marie began working at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm in 2016 as a curator and archivist after working for over 30 years in photojournalism as a photo editor. Her ongoing work of conserving the various collections at the manor, researching and uncovering the lives and identities of the enslaved and indigenous people of Sylvester Manor is an integral part of the organization's mission to preserve, cultivate, and share the stories of all the people of Sylvester Manor. She has curated the exhibitions Women of the Manor, A Place in Pictures, and All That Has Been, Our Roots Revealed. Her work at Sylvester Manor also includes ongoing photography projects relating to the memory of slavery felt in the landscape. There will be a chance for audience members to ask questions and engage with our speakers after they have presented. And I will now hand things over to Donna Marie.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everybody who is here in our intimate gathering here in person, and to all of those who are joining us online. This is a wonderful series, and as Melissa mentioned, tonight we are going to speak about the Atlantic slave trade and the relation to New York and the Northeast. Historic New York was part of the Atlantic slave trade from its very beginning, and as a port was a slave market and an integral component to the transatlantic slave trade, connecting the economies of the North to the West Indies and the sugar industry there, which was worked by transported enslaved labor from Africa. This evening, each of our panelists will present aspects of the work that they do at their historic sites, and afterwards we will have a question and answer. Our first speaker tonight and presenter is Ramin Ganeshram. Ramin is an award-winning journalist and a historian who is currently the executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture. Ramin's area of study is colonial era American history, particularly focused on the enslaved African-American and mixed-raced people. She is the author of The General's Cook, a biographical novel about Chef Hercules Posey, the chef enslaved by George Washington. Please join me in welcoming Ramin.
Thank you so much, Donna Marie. Can you guys hear me? Are you good? Okay. So the presentation that I want to show you tonight, or what I want to talk to you about this evening, is something that Donna Marie started to, initially introduced to you. Of course, New York City was a major port in the Atlantic trade, and very much involved in the sugar trade, the sugar industry, as started by the Dutch. So, but what I want to talk to you about is actually food at large as part of the Atlantic trade. So, especially when we talk about New York City, something that we often talk about is obviously Dutch trading, Those of you who remember school, one of the things that was often discussed was furs, right? Trading for furs, and then sugar. But really, when we think about the foods that we eat, things that are still eaten today in New York, things that are important to the culture of the city and the country, food is much more integral to understanding the Atlantic trade. Next slide, please. So the first thing we have to understand is the transfer of goods during this period of colonization is something called the Columbian Exchange. Many of you know this term, and this is the idea of the movement of goods between both sides of the world, the old world and the new world, right? So it was things like furs and lumber, but it was also spices. It was also sugar. It was the movement of staple ingredients, but also techniques between the two hemispheres. Next slide, please. So the Dutch were, of course, very skilled in this idea of capitalizing the Columbian Exchange. The Dutch East India Company, obviously started this trade in the East Indies, but here in New York, it was the Dutch West India Company, right? So I kind of say, if you can make it here, and they did, you can make it anywhere. The Dutch West India Company made it really big in New York City. In fact, it was the second Dutch West India Company, not the first. And so we talk about furs, yes, when you look at their records and you look at the primary source material from the Dutch West India Company, yep, there's a lot of fur trading. There's also a lot of food trading. Next slide, please. So of course, sugar, we know this story. It's not just sugar, but it's rum, right? It's molasses, very important. The American Revolution, of course, came to pass in part because of taxation on sugar as part of the Intolerable Acts. Next slide, please. But how was sugar, of course, milled, grown, and brought to the North American colonies by enslaved labor? So sugar, just as I'm sure some of you may know, does not come from the West Indies. It does not come from this side of the world. It comes from India, Africa, and so on. It was brought here as part of the Columbian Exchange. The Dutch and English colonizers really, they understood that the climate was good in the West Indies to grow sugar, and enslaved Africans were important to make that happen. Next slide, please. So here in New York, sugar was incredibly important. There were a lot of sugar factories, warehouses, trading organizations, millers of sugar. This is something called the Rhinelander Sugar House. It later became the Livingston Sugar House. It was downtown. Some of you may recognize it as the Sugar House Prison. It became a prison in the American Revolution. Next slide, please. We recognize this cup, right? So this is our famous New York City deli coffee cup. So coffee, another incredibly important foodstuff in the Atlantic slave trade. Again, grown, harvested by enslaved workers, largely in the Caribbean. Also part of the Columbian Exchange. Coffee does not grow naturally in the Caribbean. It comes from Africa, right? It comes from actually Ethiopia. Next slide, please. So coffee was so important in New York, in colonial New York, that coffee houses and taverns, you'll see there's an image there in the middle of the Tontine, which was a coffee house that later became the New York Stock Exchange, right? It was a very important site of business. A little further on, there was a coffee house called the Burns Coffee House in an old Dyckman, or actually it was the Delancey Mansion, right? The Tontine was so important in terms of the commerce and history of New York that this is the 1790 map of New York City, and right in the middle of that little box is the Tontine Coffee House. It was on Wall Street, right? Mm-hmm. So coffee, yes, is a food, it had double value, right? So next slide, please. It had the commercial value, but it also had a socio-political value. And this is how the Atlantic trade supported the American Revolution. This is an image of the statue of King George III in Bowling Green being pulled down. Where were these ideas of revolution fomented, discussed, planned? In the coffee houses around New York City. Another thing that was sold in the coffee houses, very important to coffee houses, next slide, please. Was chocolate, cocoa. So chocolate is native to Central America and parts of the Caribbean. It grows within 20 degrees of the equator. Chocolate was cocoa beans, again, grown, dried, fermented, harvested, and shipped by enslaved labor into New York City, where drinking chocolate became very important and popular in coffee houses. The material culture of chocolate, coffee pots, coffee saucers, paintings, and so on, also became incredibly important among the newly wealthy that were benefiting from the commerce of the Atlantic trade. At the bottom left, a company that still exists, founded in 1780 in Massachusetts, the Baker Chocolate Company. In fact, the partner, Dr. Baker, died on a ship on a trip to the West Indies to procure cocoa beans when the ship sunk. So this kind of the importance of the food trade as part of this Columbia of the Atlantic trade is very clear. At our institution right now, we have an exhibit called Bittersweet Chocolate in the American Colonies, and it's exactly about, in fact, the Atlantic trade and chocolate as it relates to the Northeast. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of the kind of thing that enslaved laborers were doing in the harvesting of chocolate. Obviously, this is much later. This is a photograph, but this is a heritage tradition that continued. This is in Trinidad, where my family is from, and this is called dancing the cocoa. So once cocoa is dried and fermented, the shells have to come off of it. And basically workers would sort of move around to a rhythm, to a beat, a dance that was West African and also East Indian in nature to remove those hulls. It is still done today as a heritage tradition, as a sociocultural tradition. I just thought you might like to see that. It's a direct vestige of the Atlantic slave trade. Next slide, please. So I use this, another food product, many food products that were important is I use pumpkin spice for a really specific reason. Of course, there's no pumpkin in pumpkin spice, but it does contain all the spices that were part of the Atlantic trade: nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. These are, again, spices that came from the old world. They came from the East Indies. They came from the Spice Islands. They were brought to the Caribbean to be grown, to be part of the commercial enterprise started by the Dutch, prolonged by the English, that ran on enslaved labor to create commercial enterprise in New York City. Next slide, please. And this is just a view from the period of Grenada. Grenada is still called the Spice Island for the amount of spices that are grown there. Next slide, please. So New York's currently in the Caribbean exchange and Caribbean foodways is a direct vestige of the Atlantic trade, right? We think about recent Caribbean immigrants as bringing our foodways to the city and bringing this idea as kind of newcomers, right? But in fact, it's very much related to the Atlantic trade. Some of you may recognize this. This is a Jamaican beef patty, right? I have to take issue with this, you know, because everyone says they're Jamaican beef patties. They're actually made throughout the Caribbean. We just call it patty. Next slide. And this is a Cornish pasty. So Jamaican beef patties were created in the Caribbean by enslaved cooks cooking for their English enslavers, making meat pasties or patties and using local spices and available ingredients. This is where it came from. It directly was born out of enslavement and the Atlantic trade. And of course, today it's a popular kind of street food in New York as well. Next slide, please. I don't know if any of you recognize this. This is something called black cake, also incredibly important to the Caribbean community here in New York. I think it's spreading outside of the Caribbean community as well. Next slide. Again, in the Caribbean, this is the middle is Irish Christmas cake. Brought to the Caribbean, enslaved cooks had to produce this cake using not whiskey, but rum and other ingredients locally available. What you see on either side is Emily Dickinson's black cake recipe. Emily Dickinson's family, of course, made most of their money in the slave trade. Not from New York, but still Northeast. And so the last thing I want to say to you, and kind of how we can see the history of enslavement and the trade all around us, is that it went both ways. So at the far left there, you see, does anyone recognize this? Do you know what that is? This is the seal of the city of New York. This is our seal. I say our because I'm from New York City. So what you see in that seal are barrels. These are barrels of flour. New York City, the first skyscraper skyline in New York City was in fact windmills that were mills for things like flour. The flour was produced to provision the islands, the Caribbean islands, as part of the trade. You also see, I can't quite see it from here. There's two things that relate to this. There is the barrels, and no, I'm not remembering what the other one is, but there are two elements. Say it again. There's beavers, there's barrels, and I'm now having a brain freeze, but there's another aspect that relates to wheat milling on that seal. So there were provisioning farms all around the city. And these provisioning farms produced grains, particularly wheat, that were milled in these windmill grist mills to send to the Caribbean. And I know that Donna Marie is going to talk a lot about provisioning farms in the Northeast. So I went pretty fast because I wanted to make sure to give my other panelists time, but it was a trade that went both ways. So let me say that. So it's still around us. You may not realize it, but it is.
Thank you. So I think slides wise, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Thank you, Raman. That was very great, and leads us into my conversation to tell you a little bit about where I work, which is at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, which is on the east end of Long Island. This is the beginning of it. You can do the next one. So following what Raman said about the Dutch coming to New York and the trade with the West Indies, Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island was settled in 1651. The island had been gifted to the Duke of York by King Charles I in the late 1630s. Of course, the Duke of York never came to Shelter Island or the east end of Long Island. And so all of these transactions that were happening in England. The Duke of York's man of business sold the island to another businessman who lived in Connecticut, who again never lived there. Shelter Island on the east end of Long Island is the ancestral home of the Manhansett people, who had lived there as their ancestral home for thousands of years. The Manhansets were part of the indigenous clan system of eastern Long Island, aligned with the Shinnecox, the Montaukets, and the Kutchaks. In 1651, 4 businessmen who were owners of 2 plantations, 2 sugarcane plantations in the West Indies and the island of Barbados, bought the island from the Connecticut businessman for 1,600 pounds of Muscovado sugar. Now, they owned these 2 plantations very successfully on the island of Barbados, as I mentioned, the Constant Plantation and the Carmichael Plantation. Both of these plantations still exist today. Both still grow sugar. However, they are no longer connected to the Sylvester family. Now, why would they, being so successful in Barbados, why would they need an island in the Hamptons? Well, everybody needs an island in the Hamptons. Well, the reason that they needed it was because the work was being done by transported Africans, yes. They were making more money than anybody had ever made before because sugarcane, the products of sugar became the greatest cash crop in the world. And they were not growing and cultivating any foodstuffs, raising any livestock on the island of Barbados. Every available acre of land was given over to the growth of sugar. And so they needed to import everything that they needed. And the way to do that was to provision themselves. Raman mentioned that word provision, and that was the purpose of this settlement on Shelter Island, to become a provisioning plantation. So in 1651, the youngest of the partners, Nathaniel Sylvester, came to Shelter Island. He brought with him enslaved African workers to clear the land and to cultivate crops, to raise livestock, and to harvest the timber to make barrel staves to ship back to Barbados. But wait, The Manhansett people who, as I said, lived on this island for thousands of years, did object, and they objected legally. They took the partners to court in Connecticut and sued them because they said that they had not agreed to this sale. And they actually won that suit, forcing the partners to repurchase the island from the Manhansetts, this time for 800 pounds of sugar, with the provision that the Manhansetts would vacate the island. Now, whether they understood this to be a permanent situation, we don't know. They were absorbed by their other related clans and other tribal groups in the area. Those that remained on Shelter Island, the agreement was that they had to then work for Nathaniel Sylvester and the provisioning plantation. Excuse me. Now, through subsequent years, Nathaniel was able to buy out his partners, becoming, in fact, the lord of the manor and the sole owner of the 8,000 acres. His family, the Sylvesters, were English, but he was actually born in Amsterdam. Their family had moved to the Netherlands for religious freedom, and so he was able to play both sides. He could be Dutch when he needed to be Dutch, and he could be English when he needed to be English. The property, which was originally 8,000 acres, descended through 11 generations of the descendants of Nathaniel Sylvester until 2009, when the 11th generation heir made the decision to gift the property, which now equals 236 acres of land, a 1735 manor house, outbuildings, and a working farm. We are now a nonprofit organization simply called Sylvester Manor, and our mission is to cultivate and preserve historic Sylvester Manor, telling the stories of all of the people who lived, worked, and died there. Many of these photographs, many of these photographs, the ones that look modern, I did. The ones that look old are archival images from our collection. I combined them just so you could see that not a whole lot has changed at Sylvester Manor, which in a way is very beneficial to us in being able to tell the story of how it was settled, of the enslaved people that lived there, of the indigenous people who lived there, and interpret that history through the landscape. The enslaved people lived in the house, this being the second house that, as I said, was built in 1735. The original house, built in 1651, was torn down, and this house was built on top of it. This staircase, which has been referred to by the family as the slave staircase, leads to the first floor bedrooms and then to the attic space where the enslaved and the indentured lived and worked. The photograph is of the only person of color to whom we have an image of. Her name is Julia Havens, and she was a freeborn biracial woman whose mother had been enslaved at a neighboring property, but came to live on Sylvester Manor property and on the land that she inherited from her stepfather, a Black man who in freedom was able to purchase 23 acres of land. The work that I do at Sylvester Manor is storytelling. It's using the land, the property, the house, the archives to tell the story of the enslaved and the free people of color who lived there. We have what we call an Afro-Indigenous burial ground. And this stone, which was placed on the side of the road there in the driveway in 1886 by Sylvester descendants, reads, "The burying ground of the colored people of the manor from 1651. We believe that close to or up to 200 individuals were buried in this space over 250 years. Julia Havens, the woman that you just saw the photograph of, was the last person buried there in 1908. She was close to 100 years of age, and she is buried anonymously. These stones are the only markers that are in the burial ground, and so we don't know exactly who is buried there. Part of our research now entails trying to not identify who's buried where, but who lived at the manor, who would have been buried in this space, because no other Black people were buried in the additional cemeteries on Shelter Island. Another view inside of the manor house, which again we use to interpret our stories. The last Sylvester descendant to live in the house passed away in 2006. That means from 1735 until 2006, this was a private residence that was closed to the public. Now that we are a not-for-profit organization, we do tours of the manor house, except it has been closed in COVID, and hopefully we'll have some limited inside tours. So again, this is an image on the left that was taken in the late 1880s, oh actually, sorry, early 1900s, and the way that the room looks today. The tiger skin rug lives in a trunk in the attic. He comes out for special occasions. The table in that photograph and the table with the tablecloth on it are the same. So there are vestiges of the past and the history that was lived in this house, which aid us in how we tell the story, because the house is itself a living artifact. We have done extensive archaeology at the manor, done by a team from the University of Massachusetts at Boston and the Fisk Archaeological Research Center. Just quickly, I'll tell you the story of the pot, which is our most precious artifact that was found during one of the digs. It's a large-sized pot, well, medium-sized pot, let's call it, that was found practically intact. What makes it so special is that the design on it is very classic Native American indigenous to the area. The way that the clay was mixed, it's mixed with shell, which was not a native practice. It's a West African practice. There is the evidence of a handle, which is neither native or West African, it's European. And so we believe that this pot was made by a Nigerian woman whose name was Oyo, and that she was brought to Sylvester Manor from Barbados after having been transported from Nigeria. Nigerian potters, women specifically, in their pottery, made it reflect their lives. They made pots that reflected their home. And so finding herself here on Shelter Island at Sylvester Manor, she made a pot that was indicative of the experience that she was having of working with Native women and working for a white European woman. We call this pot jazz because it is unique to Sylvester Manor and it embodies the culture of the three cultures that came together. Again, just the landscape for me holds the history, it holds the memory, it holds the trauma. And as an artist and a photographer, I use that as I walk through the lands and photograph just different scenes. We also have a working farm, which is an organic farm. And again, the photograph with the windmill on the left is modern day, and the gentleman on the right here is an archival image from the early 1900s. And again, the same. Our working farm, we employ young farmers to be apprentices, to come and live and experience what farming on this historic land. And again, just another image of the landscape that we feel holds the story. This tree is called a copper beech. It was planted in 1870 by a famous American botanist named Asa Gray, who was a professor at Harvard. It's in the end stage of its life, but the middle tree we call the mother tree, and it has split into adjacent smaller trees. And so although the mother tree is dying, and every time the wind blows and the lightning strikes, we become fearful, it will live on. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Oriel Violette, is an associate professor at Stony Brook University in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature and affiliated faculty in the Department of History. She earned her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and specializes in the working class culture, social movements, gender studies, prison reform, slavery networks, and disability studies. Please welcome Aurelie.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Caroline and Melissa for this organization. I'm so happy to be here, and I see a lot of connections with my co-panelists, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to talk about the legacies of slavery, which has already been addressed in your two talks. So what does it mean? I want to start with a question. What does it mean to live in a world where the legacies of slavery have been effaced? Really, this is what I want to address. While I was beginning to prepare for this event, I remembered a book written, and that's the next slide, by George Orwell that you might have read, 1984, in which he says the following: one could not learn history from architecture any more than one could learn it from books, statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, the names of streets, anything that might throw light upon the past had been systematically altered. So this is exactly what happened with slavery. We could just add one word to Orwell's quote, and I did it on the slide. We could say one could not learn the history of slavery from architecture any more than one could learn it from books, statues, inscription, memorial stones, the name of streets, etc., right? So George Orwell tells us so much about how power controls history and how the state domesticates memory, the future, our history, right? So it's a wonderful book. And in my opinion, it's never been more relevant than today. Us, we have begun to recognize the necessity of investigating what is hidden behind the names of those who are memorialized in public spaces and in national history. People no longer take received history for granted, instead asking what untold stories might be contained in a given monument, or who really were these generals, CEOs, and bankers singled out as great advocates of national values or as indispensable philanthropists. And we could add, what is hidden under the history of, food as well, right? Sugar, etc., as you said. So the historical narratives or commemorative plaques beneath the statues may not reveal the full story, and we might have to dig further into the archives that preserve their secrets. And this is what I do in my work. The specific question regarding slave traders, and the more general question, I would say, regarding the concealment of history in public spaces, is something that has been remarkably present in public debates. And I study public debates in Spain, but it is true in the US as well, with the question of what to do with statues dedicated to the Confederate South, right? In the wake of the deadly riots in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017. So in Spain, the country I study, one of the main countries that participated in and benefited from the slave trade, urban structures such as buildings, statues, monuments, and the names of streets have been questioned with civic associations and activists, asking governments to revisit the way the cities have explicitly and implicitly praised dictatorial politicians or slave traders. This has also happened in the US, with historians and journalists underscoring how cities were built by slaves. The best example is Wall Street, so it's a connection with what you said, right? In New York City, where enslaved Africans built a wall in 1653 to protect Dutch settlers from Indian raids. In my research, I concentrate on the Atlantic slave trade to ask fundamental questions about the construction of historical narratives and the legacies of slavery, particularly how it has been effaced in our contemporary world, how it has been effaced from what children learn about history really at schools. One of the main problems we encounter has to do with vocabulary, and I want to give you a few examples. The vocabulary with which the Atlantic slave trade has been talked about. So that vocabulary used to describe the different roles in the Atlantic trade is confusing when you do research. For example, according to historian Douglas Egerton, some planters in the US called slaveholders businessmen, right? In fact, slaveholders around the world thought of slavery as part of global market practices. And participation in the trade led to wealth and power, and it was just like any other economic venture. Edward Ball, who is another historian, explains how ships would sometimes carry 5 to 50 slaves who were oftentimes excluded from their ship's inventory or manifest. So if we research the documents, we cannot find any information about the slaves on the ships. And that's what happens to me. I work with manuscripts and I work with ships inventories, and I don't find anything sometimes. Yet, I mean, they do not exist on paper, yet they were certainly there. Before the abolition of slavery, many historians used these arguments and data to minimize the role of slave traders in their historical accounts. And we've received those historical accounts, right? Today, the heirs of slave traders use this qualification to distance themselves from their family's past. A historian in Spain called Martin Rodrigo gives a useful example of a woman called Maria del Mar Arnús, who from 1999 to 2018 published and asserted that a slave trader, Antonio López y López, who was one of the most important slave traders in Spain in the 19th century. He lived in Cuba. The history, the normal story, right? He left as a poor man and he made a fortune in Cuba, right? So making a fortune was synonym with becoming a slave trader. So the Spanish, she asserted, she published that he was not a slave trader, but a businessman who gave Barcelona and Spain an international profile, right? So the Spanish slave trader had tied to the global Atlantic slave trade, of which New York was a part. Part of the money of his company was held in international bank accounts in New York, London, Paris, Barcelona, Madrid. So to go back to her, to Maria del Mar Arnús, she's the heir of a man called Arnús Ferrer, who was a friend and business partner of Antonio López y López in the 19th century. Right? So here, this assertion makes it clear that the legacies of slavery are denied in plain sight in the 21st century, that historical data is transformed, the vocabulary is transformed, the slave trader becomes a businessman, and that facts are ignored to safeguard a family's reputation because families inherited wealth and prestige from their ancestors. So kinship is central when you research the slave trade and you want to understand it. Daughters of slave traders at that time were to marry other slave traders or their sons who would later be able to continue the business. Hence, the heir's silence demonstrates a refusal to recognize the socioeconomic impact of the legacies of slavery. And so we can consider this refusal as one of the many legacies of slavery in our contemporary world. The comfortable silence about slavery allows society to function without interrogating the roots of its prosperity. Nowadays, when looking at the legacies of slavery, the euphemising business vocabulary deployed in the characterization of these slavery networks creates another obstacle to the recognition of what the slave traders are responsible for. So slave traders, there's something we need to know is that they were aware of how to proceed. The documents that provide insight into the slave trade are difficult to find because records of illicit transactions were destroyed, particularly in the later time, right? How was the abolition process? That's also something that is important to know. It was very long. There was, a Slavery Abolition Act, the Britain Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. It didn't mean that slavery stopped altogether, that countries in Europe stopped the slave trade. It meant that the purchase of enslaved people became more expensive, making the trade more difficult. But it did not mean the complete eradication of slave trafficking. It was, and some historians say it became legally illegal, right? So at that time, upper class families received incentives to emancipate slaves. And that meant, the abolitionist discourse meant a sort of silence about slavery and the global, then the goal was to suppress its presence in the public sphere and to implement a sort of forgetting of slavery. And that's where our forgetting comes from, because the goal was just to abolish slavery at all costs. So there were, some incentives. And so that created a collective amnesia. And that implied a silencing of upper classes families' involvement in the slave trade. And that is when slave traders revamped themselves as CEO. I want the last slide, please. Because slave traders' money was redirected through banking networks and was used to create new businesses, build monuments and buildings that we still use today. So for example, I wanted to give you examples from here, right? Trinity Church in New York is one of those monuments. JP Morgan Chase is one of those banks. Wall Street, of course, as we said. So there is a need to educate ourselves about how banks, businesses, and capital built by slave traders, former slave traders, or anti-abolitionists tell us about the legacies of slavery, their durability, their permeability in the social fabric, and above all, how the economic and cultural structures of modern cities in Europe and in the US have been built through the exploitation of Black bodies. The brutality and inhumanity of the slave trade is something some countries in Europe have, and among them Spain particularly, have had difficulty confronting. But it is time for all to acknowledge if we want to build a just world. And that's why initiatives such as this one, or what is done in museums, what my co-panelists do to educate all of us and make us aware that we have cities, we evolve in a world with food monuments that are the legacies of slavery. That's why that is so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Our last presenter, Shauna Savio, is a proud mother of 3. She was born in Brownsville and raised in Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. She's an anti-disciplinary artist, curator, cultural strategist, public historian, and educator whose practice uses the intersections of art and technology, travel and urban planning to create healing, anti-racist, equitable, and inclusive spaces. Welcome.
No problem. Thank you so much. Once again, thank you so much to the Dyckman House for inviting me. I feel really, really grateful to be in this panel, on this panel. I feel so many synergies about the things that we speak about, and I'm hoping that after this, we can also continue to connect and share. So when preparing for this talk, I was trying to figure out what strategy I would use, right? I hated history growing up, mainly because it was always taught to me as facts and figures, remote people that really felt like they didn't have a connection to who I was as a person. And for that reason, I didn't see myself in history. And as my work, and part of my work as a co-director and co-founder of Grow House Community Design and Development Group, which I co-founded with my son Warner, we have really been trying to reclaim stories and really affect youth outcomes by allowing marginalized histories and marginalized youth to see themselves as the shapers of history now. Next slide, please. Can you keep going? So this is my son, Warner. He is my co-founder and co-director. Next slide, please. And part of our work has been traveling to places like Cuba, retracing routes of enslavement so that in real time, young people of color can feel what it means to occupy space and to take up space in the world. Next slide. We've done community technology days. Next slide. And the next slide, I want to get to the meat of it. So why am I here talking about history? As part of our work building a youth design and development firm, we came across a lot at the intersections of Bedford and Church Avenues in Flatbush, Brooklyn. Not understanding that it was a burial ground, we began to dig deeper and research. We were thinking of it originally as a piece of land that would form a portfolio in a community land trust that would be run by Black and Brown youth. And then in looking through the request for proposals that HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, had posted on their site, we realized that it was an African burial ground dating to the mid 1600s at least. And the community engagement process that HPD was following consisted mainly of putting signs up on posts, putting signs up on a fence, and not really talking to people in the community and engaging them around the history of this important site. I had been on a walking tour that was conducted by Black Gotham in downtown Brooklyn, and I know Kamau Ware very well, and my work really sits firmly in the lineage of the work that he does. And I began to think about cultivating a tour that would bring people together, both long-term residents, newcomers, young people, older people, people of all races, and walk through the history of Flatbush as a site of enslavement. Next slide, please. So a few lenses that I use for the work doing the walking tours is history as a tool for anti-displacement. Because if you know anything about New York specifically, about 200,000 Black families have left New York in the past 2 decades. And I think in using history as an anti-displacement tool, we can allow people to see themselves in the history of a space and therefore reclaim space by walking through it. Next slide. And the future visioning piece of it for me is in looking at history as a way of thinking about the future. This is what the Flatbush African Burial Ground looks like on the top right side. It's just been sitting fallow. It's a trash site for the most part. People didn't even recognize that it was a burial ground. And so we began to use some of the work that we've done at Row House as artists to engage our artist community to put up fence weavings, which were inspired by the work of a group called Brooklyn High Art Machine. And on the right, on my left, actually, you can see us doing the walk around the neighborhood. Next slide. So another lens through which the walking tours are done is the lens of Sankofa. It is an Akan word, which means go back and fetch it. And if you contemplate it deeply, it really is a philosophical principle that speaks about past, using the lessons of the past, and looking at the past unflinchingly in order to inform your present actions to shape a future legacy for generations to come. Next slide, please. And in another lens that I use also is this quote from historian Escurandera by Aurora Levins Morales, and I'll read it to you. So one of the first things a colonizing power or repressive regime does is to attack the sense of history of those they wish to dominate and attempt to take over and control people's relationships to their own past. Now, we all understand that when young people, specifically marginalized people of color, can see themselves in the past, it affects outcomes such as mental health in terms of their academic achievement. And this is really an important part of the work that we ground in when we do the walking tours. Next slide. Next slide again. That was a picture of a griot. I also think of ourselves as firmly in that tradition of oral history. Thinking about Sankofa, displacement is not really something that's new. If you look at history and you understand history, you'll be able to see that much doesn't change. Narratives change, right? And tactics may change. But in terms of the results of enslavement, displacement is a part of that. And if we don't face our history firmly, we will be doomed to repeat it. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay. I'm gonna ask you, because I feel like I'm running out of time and I want to get to the meat of the discussion, to fast forward to almost towards the end. There's a slide that looks just like this one. Yes, thank you. All right. Okay, here. And the next slide as well. So part of what the work as a public historian for me entails is tracing absences. Much like Aurelie mentioned, when you go to the historical record, you very rarely find names of enslaved Africans in the record. You have to dig, you have to look at census records, you're looking for runaway enslavement ads, and this is part of the work that I've been doing with the Flatbush African Burial Ground. Next slide. And next slide. Okay. So thinking about Flatbush in the context of history, geographically, it is the center of Brooklyn. If you look at it on the map, it's home to about over 100,000 people. Most of them come from the Caribbean as well as South Asia and West Africa. And in fact, rents have actually increased 20% over the last year. And I think about all of these things in relationship to one another because displacement is not new. The slides before that passed through show that it's a legacy of colonialism that was rooted in the displacement of indigenous Lenape people over time. And we are living that legacy over and over and over again. Next slide. Yes, and one aspect of gentrification is the erasure of the history of a place and the people who have contributed to it. And it's also about creating a blank slate for newcomers. Next slide. So a little bit about the history of Flatbush specifically, and I think much of this is known to this group, but not long after the Dutch arrived here, they began to use African labor in order to clear the land. If you go to Flatbush today, the major thoroughfare is called Flatbush Avenue. On Flatbush Avenue itself, historically speaking, Dutch homesteads were lined up one next to the other in order to protect themselves from indigenous retaliation due to the theft of land, okay? It was an international network, much like most people have shared here, that connected not only North America to the Caribbean, but also to West Africa. And that's a piece that I think needs to be drawn out more. I've been in many conversations through my travels to Ghana, Benin, and Togo, where it's often seen that enslavement is something that African Americans and people of African descent in this hemisphere have suffered from. But what is not understood is the legacy of colonialism that is a direct result of enslavement and the abolition of enslavement in this hemisphere. So part of the work that we've been doing is to connect and reconnect people of African descent across continents to each other to understand the shared legacy and history of enslavement. Next slide. So trading in Africans from Ghana and the Congo, specifically, if you look at the records of Brooklyn and also archaeological finds, such as the Kengas, which are Congo cosmograms that have been found in floorboards of homes that were sites of enslavement, you can tell and retrace who actually lived in those spaces. There's a large Congo diaspora that lived in New Netherlands, as was a large Akan diaspora as well. So another thing that we like to talk about, and I also like to talk about, is the fact that it wasn't just about bodies, it was about skills. When enslavers went to Africa, they understood exactly the kind of crops they were trying to grow, and they targeted specific African populations in order to bring them to the new world, quote unquote, and utilize their expertise. Much like Ramin mentioned, sugar, right? Indigo is also something that was used here in the States. And enslavers went specifically to the Senegambian region where indigo was grown and had been cultivated and had been used for long periods of time to capture enslaved Africans and bring them over to this hemisphere. As we know, rice, Senegambian region, lots of enslaved people were brought over here to grow rice because that expertise was there. Another expertise was mining. So in the Congo, mining has been a part of that culture for a very long time. In fact, copper mines were so prevalent in the Congo that I think it was the Swedish coin at a certain point was using Congolese metal ore in order to fund its creation. And so that's another thing that I would like to bring up. Thank you. So most people do not know this. I think speaking about what Aurelie was mentioning, the erasure of enslavement, that north of the Mason-Dixon line, New York had the largest concentration of enslaved people. And those enslaved people actually helped New York, specifically Kings County, to become the second largest producer of agricultural products, second only to Queens, which is really interesting. And it also speaks to the provisioning piece of it. Much of the crops that were grown were shipped to Curacao, other Dutch Caribbean ports in order to provision enslaved camps there. And yeah, enslaved Africans were found in almost every imaginable field in New York: carpentry, metalsmithing, home care, road building, architecture, and it's important to bring that history to light for younger generations. Next slide. So what was slavery like for enslaved Africans? People don't know, but John Jay, who was one of the first writers of African descent, actually lived in Flatbush and was enslaved on the Terhune farm a little bit further down the road. And I will read a little bit of what he says. Next slide, please. So he said, at 2 years and a half old, I and my father, mother, brothers, and sisters were stolen and conveyed to North America and sold for slaves. We were then sent to New York. The man who purchased us was very cruel and used us in a manner almost too shocking to relate. Our labor was extremely hard, being obliged to work in the summer from about 2 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. And in the winter, I think he says from 5 o'clock in the morning till 10 at night. And I think the interesting thing about, once again, retracing these absences and looking at what we have in order to recreate the lives of people is about creating empathy, right? Like, once again, it's not about faceless, nameless hordes of people toiling away. It is about human beings who had a life before they were taken, who had dreams for themselves and dreams for their futures, and also came from a place. In his narrative, he talks about being brought from Calabar, which is on the coast of Nigeria. And I think when Nigerian people hear this story on the tour, it moves them in a way that I think just hearing it about someone that doesn't feel connected to them, it just feels more real and more connected. So I think it's important to bring these stories to light. Thank you. So without the enslaved labor, we know that there would be no New York, much was already mentioned. And I also mentioned again that it was about specialized knowledge. Next slide. Okay, and this is, I think, where I will end. So in researching on slave voyages, one of the things that I was struck by, and I think needs to be brought up a lot more, is the fact that when you look at the places where enslaved people were brought from, it's not only West Africa, it also shows the connection to the Caribbean as well. Looking at these numbers, about 1,894 enslaved Africans were brought from Jamaica to the north in a port in New York. Same is true for Barbados, 775, Antigua, 427, the Dutch Caribbean, 316. So part of the work that I also feel is integral when we talk about enslavement, specifically in sites of global Blackness, such as Brooklyn, is to reconnect the African diaspora to one another and to allow them to see and allow us to see that our stories and our histories are connected, and that means that our futures are connected. And on that note, I will pause there and say thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for their very wonderful and knowledgeable presentations. I think what I'm struck with everything that we've all said is that I think for a lot of us, when we began this work, and even to today, the visitors that we encounter, the public who come to our historic sites or to our walking tours, will often say, I didn't know that. I didn't know there was slavery in New York. I didn't know there was slavery in the North. How come I never knew that? How come I was never taught that? And as Aurelie mentioned, these have been hidden and purposefully forgotten histories. They were not taught to us. I'm also part of a historic project on the east end of Long Island called the Plain Sight Project. And our work is to do research, to name, to count, and to tell the stories of the enslaved and free people of color, specifically on the East End. We call ourselves the Plain Sight Project because this history is literally hidden in plain sight. That was just forgotten to be remembered. It's a phrase that I used often. The stories, the history was purposely forgotten to be remembered, but they remembered to forget it. I'd like to ask all of our panelists just to maybe talk a little bit about how the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, the stories you're uncovering, how you then reinterpret that for your audiences, how it's accepted, and how, as you learn more, because going through archives is very arduous, but it's extraordinarily satisfying. And for me, at least, you get to a place where it's not just information that you can relate, it's people's lives that you're beginning to be able to retell. And just what your experience have been with that. Raman, if you want to start.
Sure. So my work is twofold. I'm the director of a history museum in Westport, Connecticut, that was once a small historical society. And we're very lucky in that we have a very extensive archival collection. We have one family collection that dates to the 1690s, from the 1690s to the 1950s. But as you said, Donna Marie, it's very arduous to go through this work, but the evidence is there. Connecticut had the most enslaved people of any New England state. It had the most, there were more individual enslavers in the North than in the South, although more enslaved people in the South. Connecticut had the longest gradual abolition of slavery of any state in the North and in New England. 1848 was the end of enslavement in Connecticut. So I think, what we try to do is make very clear to people that the records of the enslaved community, of enslaved Africans and in our part of the world, as well as New York, indigenous people as well, and mixed race people as well, is in family documents. So if you're looking for it in public records from a government, from the state, you're not going to find it. You're going to find it in the account books that a family is keeping about their individual wealth, or that a storekeeper is keeping about what he's selling and to whom he's selling it and how they're paying for it. So what we try to impart to the public is that we're talking about real people who lived real lives, who had real work. And so you have to seek out the truth in the most humble documents and be willing to kind of really pour through the most humble documents, because the truth is where you may not expect to find it.
Thank you. Yeah. So regarding my work, it has different aspects, right? On the one hand, I teach students at the college level, and then I publish on the topics that I research. So in particular, when it has to do with the legacies of slavery, which is a current project that I work on with a colleague of mine who is at another university, at Washington University in St. Louis, what we are trying to do is not only to bring to the project academics like us, but also activists, people work in museums, people work in cultures. So we have different things that, different views on the legacies of slavery. We have people work in archives like I do with documents and trying to find the impact that those documents have in our contemporary world. So we try to connect the historical research with the contemporary world, but we also want people who experience the legacies of slavery and work on them, clearly, in this case in Spain. So we have, we interview people as well. Part of the book that we're writing has an interview of a flamenco dancer. So flamenco is a dance in Spain from the south. Her name is Yinka, and she shows how flamenco, which is a national dance in Spain, is actually linked to slavery and to people of African descent who brought rhythm that were incorporated into flamenco. So people in Spain, very much like in the north, believe that they were not slaves that in the peninsula, because they believe that Spain was a country that benefited from the slave trade, but that slaves were sent to the Americas. Well, it is not the case. There were many slaves in the Iberian Peninsula. So that's something that we show, and we show it through different things, right? dance is one of them. We also have someone who created Radio Africa. So it's the African radio in Barcelona. And she, through the radio, tries to sensibilize the public to this topic. So, trying to connect academic world with kind of the, society, I would say, is part of the work that I do.
I would agree with what you just said, Orly. As someone who isn't a historian by trade, who didn't study history, part of my work is demystifying it. So this talk about going into the archives and really looking for humble documents, it can feel intimidating to the layperson. And so the goal is for everyone to feel as though this history belongs to them and that they have a right to it. Another thing that I find that's most rewarding for me in the work that I do on the walking tours is disrupting shame. Okay, so slavery is a shameful part of our history as a country. And I think people are reticent to talk about it and they hence avoid it. However, how are we going to change if we don't actually acknowledge and express how we feel about the shameful part of our past? And so during the walks, we'll have people of all races, all ages come together and disrupt the feeling and also get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's another thing that we're not the best at in American society. So we try to get people comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, having difficult conversations, examining the legacy, because then what ends up happening is you then have to talk about repair, right? You can't bury it. You have to bring it forward and bring it into the future. And so this is where history comes alive for me. And I think it's part of any historians or people who love history to bring history to life for everyday people so that it becomes something that doesn't feel so disconnected and so remote. So for me, that's what I wanted to add. I think it's an important part of the work, and bringing artists, bringing people with a different lens who can then interpret what they hear is the next phase of the evolution of dealing with history as historians.
Thank you. I think maybe we'll open for a couple of questions. Do we have questions online? Okay, yes. Just say it and I'll repeat it.
In my work, uncovering the history of this woman, Liz, who was enslaved here during the Revolutionary War, I found that over the course of a couple of decades, digitization and technology, the changes that took place really helped with my research. And I'm wondering, because you do, as Shannon was saying, you do feel like there is watchdogs sometimes in the archive system that make it hard for an everyday person to get in there. But I'm finding that technology is really helping to make some of these records more accessible. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Okay, so for those online, the question is about the digitization of archives and being able to access them more readily, as opposed to going to institutions to actually have to dive through the actual documents, and whether we have found that and what our experiences are. I'll go first, I guess, since I have the mic. Sylvester Manor, I'm very blessed to say the 11 generations that descended from Nathaniel and lived in this property never threw anything away. I call them historical hoarders. And so there is a plethora of primary source documents, some of which have been digitized and are at the NYU Fields Library, which are accessible, as well as in other archives in the region. And yes, being able to do research online is a lot easier than actually going and having to read the letters, being able to blow it up so you can read the handwriting, etc. And you can spend all of your time doing it from the comfort of your home. And so yes, it has been a great asset In addition, having technology that you can then share your research, your stories with your findings with the public through the internet, on your websites, through digital programming, through virtual exhibitions, etc., through presentations such as this, which you can join on Zoom, has really enlarged, I think, for all of us, how we reach the public. In a lot of ways, the pandemic for us as historians and as workers at historic sites had some hidden benefits, that we were able to then take the work online, which in fact then enabled us to have a much wider audience. We have a small audience here with us in person. We have a much larger audience with us this evening online. So yes, the digitalization has been a godsend and a help for us as historians and archivists, as well as for the general public who are interested in the subject.
I just want to say something. I agree wholeheartedly, right? I mean, just in the space of 2 years, and the pandemic had a lot to do with this, so much more has been digitized. You know, things that I've tried to find online 2 years ago were not, and now they are, and everything you've said is true. There's one caveat that I would like to say with online research is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking what you see online is what there is, and the bulk of material is not online, and you still have to physically go to a site. And you know, it's easy to think, oh, well, you know, the online finding aid or what's digitized, so it tells me what I want is not there, move on from that site. And in fact, you know, we have found things in in places in our own archives that you would never expect. So, you know, my first profession for 25 years is I was a journalist, right? And we were taught there is nothing like an in-person interview. Yeah, you could talk to people on the phone, but there is nothing like going there. And I think that for this work that we do about enslaved communities, at least for me, and I think my colleagues would agree, there's something very important about being in the spaces that enslaved people lived and labored and died. I mean, I firmly believe that the ancestors speak to us, they want their stories told. We've had this experience in my institution, and had we not been there, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I would like to, I agree with you completely. And I would like to add, you know, if you do online research, and let's say you work on correspondence, letters that were sent from one side to another, right? You will find one letter digitized, then, okay. But then if you go to the archive, you might find the entire correspondence of that person, and the letter is inserted between the previous letter and the letter that follows. And you don't really know what those are when you do the research online, but when you're there, you can read the entire thing. And it's like going to a site, because the documents, they speak to us, and they come to us, and we are like inside, like it's like going back to the past, right? So sometimes the way archives work is that they have these boxes and boxes. And if you find one document online, it's like taking a person out of their space, because the box in itself tells you a story. You know, the documents are surrounded by other documents, and that has value, I think.
Sure. I mean, I feel so moved by this conversation, you know, just hearing historians say that the ancestors speak to us, because that is exactly what I have experienced in my work. And I think part of it comes from being able to read between the lines, right? Like, not everything that you see online can encapsulate when you're in physical contact with the document, when you're feeling the paper. It engages all of your senses, and I think it opens you up in a way to a different interpretation of what you're reading. And a lot of this work comes from reading between the lines, especially when it comes to enslaved people who aren't in the forefront. You have to look at the entire context. You have to look at it in a timeline. You have to look at it in time and space. And so that's really hard to recreate online. And I feel that way even with the walking tours. During the pandemic, I did some walking tours online, virtual walking tours. There's nothing like getting people in a space together and being able to engage and ask questions. You know, for instance, at the Brooklyn Historical Library, having an interaction with the archivist that's there, having that conversation in real time makes a big difference in the way that you can interpret what you see. Yeah.
we have any other questions?
We have a question in the chat. We have a question from Melissa, which is the African burial flatbush being preserved in an official capacity today? For example, a nonprofit, grant protection, government support, and is there any planned archaeology for identification in the future?
Okay, so the question is about the African burial ground in Flatbush and what is being done there to preserve it.
So at the moment, the African burial ground in Flatbush is in the hands of the Parks Department. And they are working on a community engagement process. Unfortunately, that process will only be 1 to 2 months, and we're hoping that we can push back and extend that timeline. It's not a realistic timeframe in which to truly do a community engagement that's robust and is able to, properly engage communities of color, specifically people of African descent. In terms of, remains, we have asked how remains will be treated once they are encountered, and we have not gotten a definitive answer. However, I would lead you to the Parks Department site. There is a community engagement workshop that is happening on Monday, April 24th at 6:30 p.m. If you go to their website and you do a search, you should be able to find it. And it's a community input session, and I would encourage anyone who is concerned about the treatment of the remains to go to that session and share what you think. So at this time, the answer is there's no definitive plan on how remains will be treated. And the site is in the hands of the Parks Department, who are trying to push through a community engagement process fairly quickly and then move straight into design.
Can I
This
just,
coming Monday?
This coming Monday, April 24th at 6:30 p.m.
I just want to make a point here that I think is so important, and a pitch, if you will. There are numerous African burying sites around this city that are being ignored. There are former African burying sites where that there may not be remains, and they're in private hands now, but should be interpreted, right, by the city. I will give you full disclosure. I have a reason, like I have a very close reason. So my work very centrally focuses on Hercules Posey, the enslaved chef of George Washington, who after self-emancipation came here to New York City and was buried in Christie Street, in an African burying ground that was disinterred in the 19th century. I've been asking the Parks Department to interpret that site for the last 5-6 years. But there are extant burial sites. We were just told, and maybe you can elaborate, that several hundred yards away from where we sit now, there is one. So this is incredibly important. If we could get a critical mass of people, it would be an amazing thing.
So just so everyone knows, we are at the Public School 98 in Inwood, and the parking lot of this school and the auto body shop that was next door is actually the site of our Inwood enslaved burial ground. We've been working for the past several years with the Bowery Residents Committee and with PS 98 to commemorate this land. And we have done, BRC has done extensive research, making sure that there are no remains in the ground, and there are not. And so we're working on a memorial for that space. BRC is doing and has engaged the Inwood community and what they would like to see in that space. So there's a lot of that going on, and it's been going on for a couple of years. So this space is very poignant for this discussion.
Where are the remains?
We,
What happened to them?
the remains, as so far as we know, were looted, and we do not know where the remains are, unfortunately.
Newspaper accounts.
Thank you. Melissa, do we have any other questions from? Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you all. Right there.
Yeah.
You're right there. I work with people who suffer trauma. This is hard stuff. Especially for a person of color. But if you're a human being, it's hard stuff. To go through this information, to seek it out, to go around, whether it's your profession or not. You can't separate yourself from the humanity of this. How do you all take care of yourself? What do you do? You just look. After I leave out here, I'm going to walk. A walking meditation kind of thing. I live in this neighborhood. So I hear these ancestors all the time. What are you all doing to take?
So the question is, how do we do what we do? How do we self-care when the work that we do, the studies that we make it's oftentimes so difficult. The history can often be horrific. And I think we all deal with it in our own way. And several of us have mentioned aspects of feeling that we are called to do this work. I am not a historian. I also worked in journalism. I'm a photographer, but I grew up on the east end of Long Island, summering in Sag Harbor. I have a connection to the place. When I arrived at Sylvester Manor, I had not known about this place growing up, although I can see Shelter Island from my window in Sag Harbor. I knew nothing about the history of enslavement on the east end of Long Island. It was a total shock. What are you talking about? There was slavery here in the Hamptons. I knew nothing. And so becoming immersed in this work through these years that I've been doing it, it is, at one hand, difficult. It is a horrific history. It is a horrific institution slavery was. We all acknowledge that. However, in researching it, in uncovering these hidden lives, in uncovering these names, of being able to restore the names of the enslaved and the free people of color and the indigenous people, to restore their names to a public narrative and to a historical record, is part of the work and part of the calling. And that gives me joy. And although the stories that I tell, the stories that I research are about this institution of institutionalized slavery and the brutality and the horror of it all, I'm also telling the stories of survival, of resistance, and of legacies of generations. These are the people who made the place that I live in, that I am proud to live in, that I feel connected to. These are the ancestors. And so every story that I tell is a celebration of that and a joy to bring their names forth, to say that they lived here, they lived in this house, that Matilda and her sister Violet and her daughter Hagar and her granddaughter Jane lived in this place, and this is their lives, and this is where they're buried, and we honor them and we celebrate them. So with the horror and with the intensity of it, there has to be celebration. There has to be recognition that these were lives spent. These are our founding fathers and mothers who built this place that we live, who built this city, who built this state, who built this nation. And we are honored to be able to interpret that and to bring that to the public. And so there is that balance. And what do we do? How do you make it easier on those really hard days? When I walk the burial ground to know that there were over 200 people buried there anonymously and there is no list. That Julia was a 100-year-old woman who lived on the property her entire life, whose family were integral to its success, and they buried her without a headstone. There is no marker to tell me where this incredible woman is buried. That's really hard. But I can tell you a lot about her story and about who she is. And that helps, being able to walk the property, to being able to interpret it through my photographs, that helps. bringing it to the public, having school kids come, having their parents come, having their grandparents come, and having someone say, I didn't know that, but now I'll never forget it. And it makes me so happy to know it. That helps.
Yeah, I concur with so much of what you said. And I would add that for me, on most days, it's kind of a consolation and an antidote against feeling gaslit by a society that likes to pretend that we are living in a post-racial world, and that somehow African people, people of African descent, are at fault for the situation in which we find ourselves, and that we somehow do not deserve to take up space in the neighborhoods and the lands that we've built. So in doing this work, I feel empowered. It is difficult some days when I do walking tours. My kids know that I normally need a couple of hours just to be by myself, drink a lot of water, drink lots of tea, rest. Most times I'm exhausted because of the weight of the information and also the legacy that I am continuing in. I don't pretend that this is new work. I know that our ancestors have done this work, and that also gives me consolation that I am continuing in the legacy, that it's not new, that it actually is evolving what has been done before. And so on those days when I'm tired and on those days when I don't feel like getting up to actually give the walking tour, that's what gets me out of the house to do that work, is because I know that my ancestors had it way worse. I think about a story of a man named Samuel Anderson. Samuel Anderson was enslaved in Flatbush and was born into slavery in Flatbush in 1810. And by 1836, he had been able to get himself free and became one of the original investors in a town called Weeksville in the center of Brooklyn. And his story is so unknown that every time I bring him up, I'm getting chills just talking about him right now. People are like, I never knew. I thought James Weeks founded Weeksville. No, Samuel Anderson bought land before James Weeks did. And his name is now being brought into the historical record once again. And he's able to take his rightful place, partially because of the work of researching, doing the walking tours, reading between the lines, sharing his story over and over and over again. So the younger generations, the high school students who come on my tours, are now able to say, land ownership was in my past, and now it could be a part of my future.
Yes.
So this is what keeps me going, for sure. It's not easy. I hear you. When you said that, I was like, and I also have a therapist.
Yeah, right.
So that's another piece of it. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you for asking that question.
I'll be super brief. I feel lucky in that, as I said, my father was from Trinidad and Tobago. And so when you are from a Black and brown country, right, where every doctor, every lawyer, every prime minister, is a person of African descent, Indian descent, mixed race descent, my father imbued me with a sense that, that our people had value, were special, and were even more special because we survived. We survived being dragged to this part of the world and working to death and able to have children and to sustain. And that's what I remember when I do this work, which is very hard. And what I try to do is to not only talk about everybody's stories, but to bring those stories forward of people who really let me just say this, anybody who survived enslavement, had children, their descendants are alive, were remarkable. Full stop. But it's in the stories of the people who we call successful in our society that we can sustain ourselves with a sense of pride to continue. Now, I won't lie, I'm a fellow this year at Mount Vernon to do my research. And one of the great things about being a fellow is you get to walk around the property when nobody's there, right? So that site is packed with people, but you get to walk around alone. And there was many an evening when the site closed, when the estate closed, that I went over to the burial ground and I just sat there and I cried because that's all you could do, right? But I try to keep remembering that, there's excellence there. There was always excellence there. And that is kind of what keeps me going.
So I've always wanted to be an educator, and I think that's something that is dear to me, the way you have students in the classroom and you bring to them documents and you educate them about the past, things they didn't know. And that's something that, I'm lucky because students usually are very open to those problematics, but sometimes, as you were saying, I mean, they do believe we live in the post-racial world, which is not the case. So we have interesting conversations. I am from a colonial country. I'm from France. And I've seen how my country has been dealing really badly until maybe recently with colonial past, acknowledging slavery lately more than other countries, but still not enough. And I think that's part of maybe my role to, work on that and try, to maybe help in how colonial countries do have to acknowledge and make repairs. And so as a historian, I can bring, data and truth to the past. So that's something I'm invested in really highly.
Wonderful. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for being a part of this panel and for the work that you do. A couple of housekeeping things. We have some surveys. Please fill those out. If you're joining us online, please fill those out. Those really help us make every experience better. And also I wanted to let you know that our next Dyckman Discussions panel is slavery in Greater New York. So that's going to be a lot of interesting information, and it is on May 6th at 2 p.m. And it will take place at Holy Trinity Church in Inwood. So thank you again for coming.